Hey guys, welcome back. Andrew here with Ambient Endeavors, and every so often I just kind of decide I want to make a video that I want to make. I do a lot of videos for other companies and brands. I really enjoy that. Really cool that I get to do that. But sometimes I just have a topic or a thought or an angle that I want to just shoot a video for, and honestly it's because you guys follow the channel and subscribe and like and comment on my videos, follow me over on Instagram, all that kind of stuff, that I'm even able to do this. So thank you so much for continuing to support this. Please subscribe if you haven't already here, and come connect on Instagram. I love chatting over there too. So today's kind of working title of the video is something to the effect of, what do I do if my favorite pedal is in mono? This kind of stemmed from a number of comments on the recent Walrus Fable video that I did, a demo for that release. A number of people were chiming in saying, oh man, I'm so bummed this pedal is mono, I really wish it was stereo, ugh, Walrus, why didn't you make it stereo, that kind of thing. And I hear the complaint about stereo. I hear it often from you guys, and I also receive it. I think there's a lot of instances where having a stereo reverb or delay is really crucial, is really helpful, and is really fun and cool to get that really dynamic, wide, big, expansive sound in the stereo field. So there's definitely a purpose and a use for it. I especially hear the argument from synth players. They kind of live in this world where so much of their processing happens in stereo, and so I can understand that. But I've kind of returned to a love and appreciation for mono effects, if I'm honest, in the last few months. Had some conversation with friends. I've kind of explored some different approaches in my mixing, and have been refreshed by just recording multi-tracking, layering mono tracks. So we're gonna just dive into that topic. This might be a bad idea. You might roast me in the comments, and that's fine. But we can have a little discussion and just hear different people's thoughts and opinions on mono versus stereo. So I couched this video by taking these two Walrus pedals, Fable and the Lore, which are honestly two of my favorite pedals released in the last year or so. I'll note Walrus isn't paying me to make this video. They didn't even commission it. They don't even know about it. So just doing this for fun. But these two specific pedals have been ones that have gotten feedback and complaints from folks about how they're mono effects versus stereo. And so I'm just going to use them as sort of an argument, a test case for this conversation. So I'm just going to start by kind of addressing head on this question of, why wouldn't Walrus make this pedal stereo? Now, I'm not a circuit design expert, I'm not a highly technical engineer or anything like that, but I've lived and been in the world of effects for long enough to kind of have gleaned some of the basics around how pedals are designed and different sort of product design choices and things like that. And I think that that is where this conversation starts. So if you take a pedal like the Walrus Fable, it's a mono granular synthesis pedal. Walrus decided to put that out a few months ago, and they priced it at $299. And a lot of people were complaining, why isn't it stereo? Why isn't this? Why isn't it that? And the main crux in my mind of that answer is that essentially you need to have two independent circuits to create a stereo effect. Now, companies and brands will market pedals as stereo, even as they're using technology or methods to kind of get around that. But in reality, you end up having to create two different circuits, a left side and the right side, and they often have unique designs and unique DSP programming and different things like that. But you're essentially putting two different circuits in one box. So that brings us to another term that industry folk will use called BOM, or bill of materials. It essentially means all the different little components that go into making your pedals. When you have a stereo effect, you essentially double, if not more, your bill of materials, your number of parts to make those two distinct circuits. So that obviously will impact the price, and a lot of times as you're designing a product, even incremental small additions to your price kind of scale in a 5x or 10x sort of way in terms of end price of the product. So you might be adding something like $10-ish or so to your bill of materials, but if you're a customer, you're going to see that price increase of $50+ on the other side, just to account for that increase in materials, and also labor and any other overhead that goes into creating that pedal. So that's a big factor in this conversation. Stereo effects essentially mean 2 independent circuits instead of 1. That means more parts, that means more intensive production, and that means a higher cost to you. So the other thing I think of when I think of this mono versus stereo debate too is that a lot of times creating an effect that is stereo will also invite other features like MIDI, like presets, like other sort of control functions and things like that, that again add intricacy and detail and complexity to the build, and also cost. It moves certain pedals into different echelons and certain price tags, and in doing so you kind of can price out certain customer bases. So if you have a pedal that's going for $299 like this one, you attract a certain type of buyer, you attract a certain demographic of customer. And if you were to make the pedal in stereo and increase the cost, you kind of run the risk of pricing out certain customers that would maybe have stretched to buy it at $299 but just can't afford to at $399, $499, that kind of thing. So it's another factor when it comes into product design and decision making for pedal companies like this. So that's sort of like the business side, the decision making side that I imagine pedal companies are considering and thinking about when they're designing these products. It's fun for me to think of that kind of thing. I kind of live in that world a little bit too. But let's flip over to the original question in what can I do? How can I salvage my favorite effect if it's in mono? Now, I think this is an interesting thing to think about too, and it goes into approaching how we use effects. It goes into, like I said, my mix philosophy, my mix strategies, and I think it's worth not throwing the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to effects that are in mono, especially some of our favorite sounding effects. So I think one of the most logical starting points for me is talking about mixing and mix philosophy. Now, mixing is something I've kind of gradually improved at and learned about in the last handful of years as I've gone into this rhythm of writing and releasing music and doing demos. It's not something I have formal training in or a pro at it by any means, but I think a lot of it has been gleaned from other people's work, from just the repetition of doing it, and so it's also something that's kind of changed and shifted recently with me again. After hearing a quote that was something to the effect of, if everything is in stereo in your mix, then nothing's really in stereo. And I think the quote gets at this reality that not everything needs to be in stereo, and probably shouldn't be either. And that maybe a couple elements of your mix benefit from having a really wide, big, dynamic stereo feel. But in a lot of ways, the other elements are better if they're just individual mono tracks. Mixing becomes a lot easier actually when you're just dealing with one mono track, finding its place, doing EQ and compression and things like that to a single track, instead of having to manage left and right tracks for every instrument, every track, and kind of make sense of where they need to be in the stereo field. So one of the arguments I do kind of hear is from keys players who complain about some of these pedals not being in stereo. I think that world is one where a lot of players live in stereo, and I think that can be one of the elements that often shows up in stereo in mixes, especially for big textural pad stuff, for the kind of ambient layered elements that benefit from that wide stereo field, or the dynamic left and right effect. And so I can understand when keys players come back and are like, oh man, I really wish that pedal was in stereo, because I think that is one of the few elements that end up usually being in stereo in certain circumstances. But yeah, what I've noticed as I've kind of leaned back into mono effects and not overusing stereo tracking is that it's allowed me to do either do fun techniques to create more dynamics and more space and dimensions, like multi-tracking, double tracking parts, and it's made the mixing process easier to, again, just not have to be sifting through tracks and tracks and kind of managing these dual track tracks in every instance. I end up using stereo tracking for a lot of the like loop beds that I do in pieces, for some of the more ambient and textural stuff that I really want to have separation and space in the mix. But a lot of times I'll end up recording rhythm and lead tracks in mono, and then sometimes double tracking and creating some separation that way too. But what you get when you double track versus recording with a stereo effect is this sort of human element of the nuance difference between each of the tracks, and I think that does a lot to add dimension to your mix, interesting nuances and dimension to the overall sound, instead of just recording with a stereo delay or reverb that's kind of creating this synthetic perception of space and dimension oftentimes. There's also so much you can do in post-production in the mixing process in your DAW, with automation, with panning, with different in the box effects too, if you want to create dimension from a mono track and sort of either make it sound stereo or give it stereo movement. And that's been a fun area for me to dive into too, and not have to worry about how I'm capturing a stereo track, just sending mono tracks in and then using those techniques to create movement and dimension and space in the mix too. So those are just a few takeaways from me as I've kind of leaned back into appreciating mono effects and changing my mix philosophy a little bit to account for using mono versus stereo. But I do think that remembering the context and the purpose and the use cases for mono and stereo effects is important, and so hopefully this kind of helps to hit on some of those things. The second part I want to get at is how do we kind of redeem mono effects if you really truly are wanting to continue to live in this like stereo dimension world, but your favorite effect is in mono. I think there's a few ways that we can do this really easily. I think in my experience, I do this all the time, and I don't personally feel like it loses that much dynamic or excitement or things like that when it comes to integrating effects in the signal chain. So the first thing that comes to mind, again, as we're talking about these two Walrus pedals, we've got like the Lore, which is a reverse delay kind of workstation. We have the Fable, which is a granular synthesis pedal. I love granular effects, so I kind of will live there, and a lot of the pedals that I have in that camp are mono. So what I end up doing is either one of two things. So I'll put a really dynamic stereo reverb or delay or both after those pedals. So it allows you to run those mono granular synthesis pedals in and let the stereo delay or reverb do their work and their magic of creating the stereo dimension and the width and that. There are so many good stereo reverb and delay pedals out there. You can kind of lean into them and play them to their strengths too, while still capturing that nuance and texture of those granular pedals. So that's one thing I would always recommend, is just throw a great reverb or delay in stereo after the pedal and see what happens. The other thing too that I've had a lot of fun with in a few videos, and what I was demonstrating in the intro sketch here too, is just taking two of your favorite mono pedals and running them in parallel in stereo. So for this sketch, I had the Lore on the left side, the Fable on the right side, and it's just really cool to kind of hear how they each dance around and play off of each other and things in the parallel stereo field there. And so you get some really cool dimension, you get some nuance, you actually get some interesting things happen left and right, because you're running, again, two unique effects, one on the left and one on the right. So that's a fun experiment to do. You've got to find some sort of stereo pedal to run before it as a splitter from your mono signal, but from there you can just pick, two of your favorite mono effects, try running them in parallel, and see how that sounds. So the last thing that I'll circle back to, the third thing here, is just the technique of double tracking. So this is something that everyone in the industry will use at times for this type of effect. It's a standard studio trick. And it basically just means you sit down and do a take of the same part 2 different times, so that you have subtle differences in each take that you can work with and manipulate, place in the stereo field at different places, or affect with different sort of things in post-production. And I do that a lot with rhythm guitars to make things feel big and thick. I sometimes do it with lead parts, again, to add this stereo dimension without throwing a bunch of effects on the parts. And it's just a fun way to try and capture that stereo dimension and do a little more of the tweaking and the work in the box in your DAW while you're mixing, instead of just slapping a delay on and hearing the ping pong or the effect of that. So give that a try. That's been really fun for me to kind of learn how to use that in mixes and hear the results of the 2 different takes. So like I said, this is just kind of a fun video for me to make, to talk through some of my thoughts about mono versus stereo, to explore some of the philosophical shifts that I've felt and have kind of happened in the last few months as I've talked to friends and just kind of evaluated how I'm using stereo and mono effects. And let me know what you think. If you agreed or disagreed with anything, if you've got thoughts about how you use stereo effects, why you choose them, if you don't mind mono, whatever sort of position you are in this conversation, this discussion, I'd love to hear your input on it. Like I said, I'll still be playing stereo effects, I'll still be playing mono effects. I'm gonna play and demo both and find the use cases and find the context and find the techniques that I can do to maximize and utilize those effects whenever. Thanks for watching, thanks for engaging with this with me, and we'll see you next time.